In this video, we will demonstrate the indirect technique of wax pattern fabrication for full metal crown. The casts are mounted and adjusted on a semi-adjustable articulator. PKT number 1. The tips are round, curved, and tapered. This instrument is used to apply wax to form cusp cones and ridges. PKT number 2. One tip is round, curved, and tapered, while the other end is pointed. Like PKT number 1, this instrument is used to add wax. PKT number 3 is a burnisher for refining occlusal anatomy. PKT number 4 is a carving instrument that is used to define, shape, and smoothen external contours of wax-ups, as well as to remove excess wax at the cavo surface margins. PKT number 5 is a wax carver useful for establishing the developmental grooves. Number 7 waxing spatula is useful for adding large amounts of wax, particularly in forming the initial coping. We'd also use an ethanol burner, Bart Parker blade number 11, a colored pencil, Type 2 inlay wax, dye spacer, and dye lubricant. After the dye has been trimmed, the finished line should be marked with a sharp red pencil. Note that the side of the pencil tip is used to keep the line width to a minimum. The dye spacer should be applied to the preparation area of the dye to provide space for cement. Care must be taken to keep the material at least 1 millimeter away from the margin. To prevent the wax from sticking to the dye stone, coat the dye thoroughly with dye lubricant and allow it to soak in for several minutes. Apply the lubricant onto the proximal surfaces of adjacent teeth and onto the opposing teeth as well. If the surface of the dye appears dry after this period of time, repeat the application. Remove any excess lubricant with a gentle stream of compressed air. Waxing should not begin until the lubricant has soaked in completely. Let us begin with the fabrication of wax pattern following these steps. There are two methods to fabricate a coping, either following the add-on technique using a hot number 7 waxing spatula, or we dip the dye into a wax bath, which is a small metal container filled with molten wax. In this video, we will follow the dip-in technique to develop a uniform thin initial coping on the dye. Hold your hand vertically with the dye 90 degrees to your palm. Support your hand on the dipping pot and swipe the dye in a curving motion so the wax flows around the dye and through the V-shaped preparation. Dip the dye just below the margin. Now withdraw the dye slowly. Stop just before the tip of the dye leaves the wax. The wax will pull away from the tip of the dye and leaves only a small dot of excess wax. Next, we're going to remove wax that has flown beyond the margin using a carving instrument. The next step is the bulk addition of sufficient wax using a large instrument to allow the pattern to be handled without deformation or breakage. Heat the tip of the instrument adequately by passing it through the flame. Pick up an increment of wax and reheat the shank of the instrument. We will add wax circumferentially and on the occlusal surface. Then trim the wax back to the margin so the coping can be removed and evaluated. Wax should be allowed to cool thoroughly before the coping is removed from the die. This is done by maintaining a constant light grip on the pattern by the thumb and forefinger of one hand while applying pressure against them with the thumb and forefinger of the other hand, which also holds the die. The die is pulled from the pattern by bending the fingers of the left hand. Very gently lift the pattern and check the internal aspects to ensure an adequate registration of the necessary details and place it back onto the removable die. At this point, adjust the coping as necessary to be completely clear of the opposing occlusal surfaces. To ensure that the finished restoration will have adequate proximal contact with the teeth adjacent to it, the wax pattern should be slightly oversized mesiodistally. The best way of achieving this is to remove a small amount of stone from the proximal surfaces of the teeth on the cast on either side of the prepared tooth. To control the amount of stone removed, blacken it with a pencil. Then use a laboratory knife with a sharp number 11 blade to scrape off the graphite. The proximal contacts of posterior teeth are located in the occlusal third of the crowns. The size and location of the contact areas should be established before the remainder of the proximal surfaces are waxed. Add wax to the contact areas until they are the correct size, properly located, and consistent with the anatomic form. The buccal and lingual surfaces should be shaped to follow the contours of the adjacent teeth. Wax the axial surfaces gingival to the height of contour to form a smooth, flat profile. Add wax to join the axial and proximal surfaces and smooth them, paying particular attention to the location and shape of the mesial and distal transitional line angles. Shape the middle third of the axial surface using the adjacent tooth as a guide. The tooth surface gingival to its height of contour, called the emergence profile, is usually flat or concave. The location of the height of contour is particularly important. On mandibular molars, the buccal height of contour is located in the cervical third, while the lingual height of contour is located in the middle third. Shape the proximal surfaces gingival to the contacts to the correct contour. The proximal surfaces of natural teeth tend to be flat or slightly concave from the contact area to the cemento-enamel junction, and any restoration must reproduce this feature. Prior to commencement of occlusal surface wax-up, let's take a moment to review some basic anatomy of this tooth. Remember that mandibular first molars have 5 basic cusps: mesiolingual, distolingual, distal, distobuccal, and mesiobuccal. The central groove is not a straight groove. It tends to zigzag through the occlusal surface as it moves around the triangular ridges. The developmental grooves separate the cusps from each other and from the marginal ridge. The triangular ridges Form supplemental grooves that point up towards the cusp tips. With that target in mind, we can begin placement of the cusp cones onto the wax pattern. In this video, we will demonstrate the establishment of cusp to marginal ridge scheme. To help you visualize this, close the articulator and check the occlusion on the other side. The unprepared tooth has its contacts in the marginal ridge areas and central groove of the opposing tooth. That's the target areas we'll be aiming at during the occlusal surface wax-up. When we pick up an increment of wax, we must heat the shank of the instrument and not the wax. Determine the position and height of cusps with wax cones for each cusp, and mark the central fossa of opposing teeth to help position the cusps correctly. Accurate occlusal contacts are developed by adding wax cones and closing the articulator while the addition is still soft. Similarly, the distal buccal cones and distal cones are developed. This step is applied to the lingual cusps as well. All cones are positioned and tested for interferences in all exclusions. The cones should also be positioned so they follow the anteroposterior curve, curve of Spee, and the mediolateral curve, curve of Wilson. Give each cusp a triangular ridge that runs toward the center of the occlusal surface. As each ridge is added, close the articulator, note the small depression and adjust this to form a convex surface so that pinpoint contact exists. Place buccal ridges on the buccal cusps by applying wax from the tip of the cone to its base. This will produce the outline of the final contour of the buccal surface. Then, add mesial and distal ridges to the buccal cusps and complete the buccal contour by blending these ridges into the buccal surface. Check the inclines of these new ridges for compatibility by moving the articulator through excursions. For the construction of the marginal ridges, wax is placed to connect the mesial ridge of the mesiobuccal cusp to the mesial ridge of the mesiolingual cusp. This is repeated on the distal ridges of the distal cusps. Remove the pattern from the working cast and seat it back after applying a fresh coat of lubricant. Remelt the entire marginal periphery with a hot PKT number 1, making sure the wax is melted through to the die. This will result in a depression 1 to 2 millimeters wide. Eliminate the depression by adding wax using a hot number 7 waxing spatula. Carve the excess wax almost to the margin with a PKD number 4. The purpose of finishing is to provide a smooth surface for casting. The cervical contour of the restoration should be continuous with the contour of the unprepared tooth structure immediately cervical to the preparation margin. The location of the contact area is checked once again. The proximal surfaces should be flat or slightly concave and should be shaped to eliminate any directional change between the root surface and the finished restoration. The information provided by adjacent and opposing teeth is used to determine the optimal position and shape of each cusp. Smooth transitions between the occlusal components must be established. The shape of the tooth at its greatest convexity should be evaluated by looking at the wax pattern and comparing its shape with that of the contralateral tooth. Now that the final evaluation of the occlusal and axial surfaces has been performed, the pattern is ready for investing and casting.